So we're going to have two papers today from our two colleagues who are here on the panel with myself, and then we'll have a question and answer at the end, and we aim to end obviously at 6:30. And we're going to begin with a paper by my colleague Dr Lisa El Refaie, who is reader in visual communications in the School of English, Communication and Philosophy, and who works in the areas of visual and multimodal forms of narrative and rhetoric, and will be our first speaker. Our second speaker will be Amrutha Mohan, who is a PhD candidate in the SN College at the University of Kerala in India, and who's working on comics and graphic novels, and is a virtual visiting scholar with the School of Modern Languages here at Cardiff University. So we'll begin with a paper from Lisa, and then we'll have a paper from Amrutha, and then we will have some questions and discussions at the end. So I think I'll hand over first to Lisa for her to begin this really exciting webinar today. Over to you, Lisa.
Thank you very much, Claire, and thank you for inviting me to speak. So I'm going to be talking about metaphors of infertility in women's autobiographical comics. So generally, I'm interested in metaphors used to represent health conditions and illness, and this infertility is one of the themes I'm interested in. So I'd like to start with an example from one of the books, which is Paula Knight's The Facts of Life. Paula Knight is a British comics artist, and this page is towards the beginning of the book, and she's trying to decide whether to be a mother or not, and she's represented it in a way that she's drawn herself with her sort of present identity as an artist, and then facing herself as she imagines herself being pregnant, and in the middle is obviously time, a metaphor for time running out. And we can see, as it says at the beginning, I didn't feel confident about the prospect of becoming a mother, but I had to hurry and decide one way or another. And the word "another" is also trickling down. So that's representing this opposition, and there's also this the black and white background, and this sense of it being a kind of balance between the two at this stage. So there's a sort of yin and yang thing going on as well. Anyway, so one of the books that inspired me a lot was Thomas Laqueur's Making Sex, which is where he describes these two competing models of sex and gender in the West. So one he describes is really started in antiquity, and it's the idea of woman as an imperfect version of man. So he calls it the one-sex model. But then post-Enlightenment, another model was developed, which was then woman as the complete opposite of man, which he calls the two-sex model. And what he says is that actually both models unambiguously proclaim difference. So there's this idea that the two are incompatible, and that there's basically a vertical axis of hierarchy, whereby men are considered higher up in the hierarchy than women, and finally that they're caught up in a complex web of metaphor. So both of these models, we use metaphors to try and understand these differences, supposed differences between men and women. So that's of interest to me, because I'm interested in metaphors and how we use those to understand different aspects of our lives. So one of the elements of the way men and women are understood is pronatalism. So the idea that motherhood is a sort of natural and a necessary essence of womanhood, and within this understanding, this ideology, women who are involuntarily childless are seen as tragic objects of pity, and those who choose not to have children are seen as, as evil in some way, or as lesser women, and they're condemned and marginalized for it. So if you look at the metaphors that are used in Western consumer societies, so there's been research on American, Australian discourses in particular, but I think it's also valid for discourses in the UK. The ones that keep popping up again and again are journey metaphors, which are common generally when people speak about illnesses or health conditions or their life situation, but also battles, games, race against time is a very common one, lottery and investment. So this sense that in order to achieve the goal of fertility, you often have to invest time and money and effort to get there. But what's interesting about these is that they are very culturally specific. So I think because we're so used to them, we see them as being more or less expected or natural even. But there's one very interesting study about rural Cameroon in the 1980s where the main metaphors used to talk about fertility and infertility was relating to this idea of supernatural forces that are intervening in food preparation. So when a woman is infertile, it's to do with this, a sort of evil spirit acting upon a food and boiling it in some way. So I'm particularly interested in visual metaphors or multimodal metaphors in some cases. And the way I define visual metaphor is in quite a broad sense. So the idea that a visual metaphor is any visual representation that invites us to consider one kind of thing, concept, or experience in terms of another. So this is obviously inspired by conceptual metaphor theory, which some of you may be familiar with. And in this book that I published a couple of years ago, I also described then different kinds of metaphor, and I distinguish between pictorial, spatial, and stylistic metaphor. I won't have much time to talk about that today, but if you're interested, let me know and we can have a discussion about that perhaps. So I'd like to turn then to the first book. I'd like to talk about, this is by Sarah Lightman, again a British author, artist, and it's called The Book of Sarah. So Sarah Lightman is Jewish, and it's also a reference to the story of Sarah in the Bible. And a lot of the book is about her decision whether to the struggle with the decision whether or not to be a mother, and she starts early on by talking about how in Jewish tradition the idea of family and of sort of passing on your heritage is so central to their identity, really. And here she has drawn herself with her mother and her grandmother. And it's interesting how she has drawn her mother and her grandmother as if they're almost ghosts. So there's no detail. There's this sense really that they have passed on their identity or their traditions, and that she is sort of the keeper then of this aspect of the identity. And then throughout the book she uses I would say what are quite traditional images of fertility, and so she's drawn, first of all she draws this box of eggs, and she's written underneath, thoughts of motherhood by a woman by an uncertain 36-year-old. And then it continues over several pages where she's just drawing this box with an egg at a time, one egg taken out. And it's sort of, how long have I got left? Is it my choice anymore? Was it ever? My father said I shouldn't leave things too late. My mother asked if I was having doubts. So I think this is very much this idea again of a race against time in a way, and then she ends by saying my need to feed. So she gets obsessed with baking at one point. My need to feed might just be thwarted maternal instinct. Back to that egg thing again. So again, this idea of, first of all, a metaphor of the eggs, obviously, which relates directly to fertility. And then this idea as well of traditional concepts of motherhood and caring nature of mothers, and nurturing, of course, as well. But anyway, in the end, she does decide to have a baby, and here he has arrived. My son is 5 days old, yellow, loud, and hungry. And then the midwife, smile, said the midwife. And then on the next page, she has drawn herself, she's drawn her cesarean scar, and she writes underneath, you have a beautiful scar. So obviously, you would expect to have a beautiful baby boy, but she's drawn here the scar that looks a bit like a smiling face, but obviously a scar also stands for the suffering, not just undergone in the course of pregnancy and birth, but also I suppose the difficulties that she's anticipating, and then they do decide then not to have a second child. The second book I'd like to talk about is by an American, Phoebe Potts. It's called Good Eggs, and again she describes that she was really quite ambivalent about motherhood, but then at a certain point in her life, she suddenly gets completely obsessed, and she's drawn herself here with as if you can see into her brain and the brain of her partner. And obviously, she says, concerned about different things. So here the baby is filling up almost all her brain, whereas for her partner, he's just thinking about his classes and sports and things like that. So although obviously she's doing it in an ironic, humorous way, I think there's still this idea of men and women being different in their attitudes towards procreation, and it being far more central to a woman's concerns than to the man's usually. Anyway, and then she also sort of discusses quite explicitly the way in which in America there's this idea that you have to sort of invest and you have to be a good person, and if you spend time keeping fit and healthy and spend money on keeping fit and healthy and so on, then you should be rewarded. You're a good person. And she said, and she says here, and again, it's done in a humorous way. So she says, I married a nice, partially Jewish boy. I recycle, I vote, I eat my greens, I go to yoga, and so on. I work for the poor. And then she says, so where's my baby? So at this stage, she's obviously having problems conceiving. And so she's, in a humorous way, representing some of the ideas that are quite common in America, really. And then the other thing she then talks about a lot is how she's how then when she starts to undergo fertility treatment, how the whole thing is medicalized and how overwhelmed she feels by it, really. And so this is just sort of one consultation she has, but she's drawn it in a way that the speech balloons are completely dominating the page, and she has no time really to think about it, and then also the she's getting this intravenous injection, which it's obviously huge, and also gives a sense of how medicalized the whole process is. The final book I wanted to talk about is one that's perhaps the most, I would say, the most critical of dominant attitudes towards fertility and motherhood, or pronatalism. And this is again by a British artist, Paula Knight, The Facts of Life. So she very well, in the beginning, she also talks about being very ambivalent about becoming a mother, as we saw in the drawing I showed you right at the beginning. And then when she then, they do undergo fertility treatment, but it's not successful, and they decide then after 1 or 2 rounds, I think they decide to give up anyway. They don't continue with it. And so the final part of the book is all about, her trying to understand why it was so important to her and what pressures, social pressures there were, that made her feel it was so essential for her to be a mother. And so this, for example, she's actually used the sense of, in comics, of panels. You can use panels to create a sense of distance between things, but you can also connect them together in some way. So she's written the word mother, obviously the M in one panel and other in the second panel, and then she's drawn herself again very small compared to the mothers on the left-hand side, saying, I didn't want to join the club anyway. Again, to remind you of this this image I showed you in the beginning with the hourglass and the time running out, and at that point she was still trying to decide between the two, and this image is then echoed towards the end of the book, where she has again drawn herself twice, with the hourglass in the middle, but here the sand has actually already trickled down. It's all run out, and she's drawn herself, as a very with quite a happy expression as an artist, and then as she's come through that difficult time, she's actually surrounded by the objects of her creativity, and she's looking a bit disheveled, but very, very happy and satisfied. So I think all three books, to a certain extent, challenge pronatalism, but I would say that the final one, Facts of Life, is the one that's most explicit about really subverting this idea of women, it being women's destiny necessarily, and there being having to make a choice between, for example, a creative life and motherhood. And so the very final image she uses is this one, where she has drawn sort of literalized the ideas of labours. So she's got these labours that have replaced the panels in the comic, really, and one, it says childless or child free, and she's drawn herself sort of spanning the two, and then it says neither, just me. So again, she ends with this very positive image of herself, engaged in productive, creative pursuits. Yeah, so that was me. I hope I wasn't too long. I'll stop sharing now.
Thank you very much, Lisa. What a wonderful series of texts, and I think we'll raise some really rich issues around the graphic format as a means to illustrate and to comment and construct life histories. Thank you very much. So over to our second speaker, Amrutha Mohan. So if I can hand over to you, Amrutha, if you want to share your screen, and then we'll move on to questions, colleagues, at the end. Thank you.
Is it visible, Dr. Claire?
Yes, it's perfect, Amrutha. Please do. It's great.
Okay, thank you.
Start.
Thank you, Dr. Claire, for your introduction. My paper today, titled Imagine Childhood, a representation of the child in graphic narrative, is concerned with the ways in which the figure of the child and plurality of their childhood experiences in conflict zone is imagined and represented in two graphic life narratives, Malik Sajat's Munnu and Leela Abdul Razak's Badawi. As we all know, the textual, social, and cultural construction of childhood and the recurring presence of the child narrator in life narratives and other literary genres have always been a matter of academic debates. The life narratives that deal with an adult narrator or author is reflecting the childhood experiences is necessarily a process of walking down the lanes of memory, a work of looking and writing back, and a repertoire of remembrance and forgetting. The child often occupies a paradoxical position as a subject which sees and as an object which is being seen. The unique visual-verbal rhetoric of the comics often provides an ideal vehicle by which the ambiguous position of the child can be represented and utilized as a frame to refer to the past and to understand and often question the present. The children who are trapped in the labyrinth of conflict zone are much more than helpless victims who needed to be rescued. And it is hence pertinent to look at the myriad representation of childhood from different geographical, and political contexts, and the gross violation of their rights to dissociate ourselves from the claims of stereotypical portrayals of the victimized childhood. Here, the two graphic texts I deal with, Malik Sajat's Munnu, Boy from Kashmir, and Leela Abdul Razak's Badawi, both are located in two different geographical and cultural contexts. But both of them deal with the protagonist's traumatic experiences of growing up in a conflict zone. Now, I'll briefly talk about the historical context in which these works are written, and I shall first locate Munnu in the geopolitical context of Jammu and Kashmir and in the broader context of Indian subcontinent. So this is the political map of India, and the second figure shows Jammu and Kashmir. So Kashmir is India's northernmost geographical region, which is deemed as a paradise on earth due to its panoramic landscapes and bewitching natural beauty. Historically, it was ruled by Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, and Dogra dynasties. The land bears the effect of colonialism and the scars. Oh, sorry. Oh, sorry. Yeah, the land bears the effect of colonialism and the historical wound of India-Pakistan partition that happened in 1947. The land became a major point of dispute between India and Pakistan, eventually turning it into a militarized zone punctuated with crackdowns, curfews, disruptions, and death. The exodus of Kashmiri Pandits, a minority Hindu community, due to debatable reasons, is also a matter of concern because it is shrouded in the historical, in what we call as the historical amnesia. So the conflict still remains unresolved, with generation of Kashmiris suffering the repercussions of a traumatic past and insurgent present. So the other text which we deal with is Leela Abdul Razak's Badawi, and it is located in the context of the Palestinian disaster called Nakba, and also in the context of Lebanon wars and also Lebanon-Israeli conflict. So this is the map of Palestine. I mean, the one shows the refugee crisis, the one which demonstrates the displacement of refugees to different neighboring countries of Palestine. So the Palestinian Nakba, which has its root in Zionism, refers to the destruction of Palestinian homeland in 1948. And these events like Al-Nakba and Naksa remains as a significant part of the Palestinian memory. The ethnic cleansings lead to the displacement of thousands of Palestinians to other places as refugees, including Lebanon. And here, Badawi, the title refers to one of the refugee camps in Badawi, which is located in Lebanon. So the text also mentions about major historical junctures like Lebanon War and Israeli-Lebanon conflict, which had an adverse effect on the Palestinian refugees in Lebanon. So now moving on to the text, Malik Sajat's Munnu, A Boy from Kashmir, which is published in 2015, is a graphic life narrative that explores the harrowing experiences of growing up in a conflict zone. Resonating Spiderman's mouse, Munnu shows himself, demonstrates himself and all the Kashmiris as Hanguls. As you can see, the cover page of Munnu, and it shows the endangered species of Kashmiri deer, and it highlights the precariousness of their existence. Leela Abdul Razak's Badawi is a graphic narrative in which the author traces her father's life as a young boy in a refugee camp in Badawi. The text not only traces Ahmad's journey, but also shows many critical historical junctures and traumatic events, including the Lebanon War, that has adversely affected the life of Palestinian refugees. So the cover page of Badawi portrays a child turned back, which is obviously a tribute to the child Handala created by Naji al-Ali, as a symbol of a child seer and witness to the suffering of Palestinians. The seeing child implies every child who had to witness violent events and his evolving political awareness. One must also note how Munnu is engaged in political discussions in the text and criticism through his cartoons from a very young age. His political cartoons, which offered caustic criticism against establishments and power structures and questioned the state's biopolitical demands, can be regarded as a sort of parousia, or if we borrow the term Foucauldian notion for speaking truth to power. So now I'll look into how the narrator reconstructs the engagement of the child with the intimate spaces of home and school. The children in both the narratives experiences a sense of unhomeliness. Munnu identifies how he feels like an alien in his own homeland, while in Ahmad's case, the refugee camp has turned to his own home, which is in conflict with his identity as a refugee. And as we all know, and as Main and others quote, the childhood memories are not separable from the spaces that contain them, and that subsequently framed them in comic memoirs. So both of these narratives demonstrate the boys' engagement with their intimate spaces of school and home. In Badawi, the communal space of the camp is represented as warm and friendly, where people try to construct a sense of belonging and normalcy. In both works, family is presented as an affectionate space and as a crypt of cultural memories. But the home is no more an ideal haven, and it is imagined as it is imagined to be. A bombshell can explode any time during the war, as shown in Badawi, or a military person can intrude into your home, create ruckus, and arrest one of your family members in suspicion of illegal activities, and you might not see him again. So this is what happens in Munnu. So the conflicts, hence, are not political projects that happen outside the emotional contours of the child, but intrudes into the affective spaces of the family and home. So the quotidian existence in the conflict zones is permeated by violence, uncertainty, and death, also affecting the mental escapes of the children, which often manifests in the form of trauma disorders and nightmares. While Munnu draws Kashmiris as Hanguls and military men or policemen as human beings with defined features to metaphorically convey the zoopolitical discourse of animals being hunted down by human beings. Ahmad imagines the enemy soldiers in a more abstract way. The images of the enemy soldiers are presented in a grotesque shape with abstract shadows, like shadow-like figures devoid of defined facial features, which bestows an aura of monstrosity and bestiality to them. So through this economy of her strokes, Leela Abdul Razak, the author illustrator here, effectively conveys the child's imagination of the enemies, which has more of an abstract quality rather than an adult's serious political purpose. And you can see those figures here, those hybrid bestial human figures in this slide. So this is from Munu. Similarly, after witnessing the public mourning rituals of a youth who was assassinated by the military, Munu suffered from nightmares as he was frightened and anxious about the survival of his siblings and parents in such a turbulent political climate. This is a slide, a panel which shows Munu's nightmares of losing his elder brother. So apart from the space of home, the school functions both as an intimate and social space, a confined public space within the surveillance of teachers. The impoverished condition of the school is demonstrated in Badawi with a tinge of childlike humor. It is also pertinent to look into how in Badawi, the games played by the children, in spite of whether it is played in the school or in other premises like outdoors or in the premises of home, they are also represented in the backdrop of war, which is a metaphor of how violence eclipses the innocent and carefree life of the children. In the episode title, in one of the episodes titled Chess, which portrays a game of chess played by Ahmad in the basement of the apartment during an airstrike at Lebanon, one notes that the chessboard bleeds onto the page, hinting at the violent political scenario. So, but in Munnu, the representation of the childhood spaces adopts a much more serious tone. The children had to frequently change the schools due to political upheavals, and these schools are often held in old or makeshift buildings. At times, when the schools are closed down due to crackdowns, the children had to attend religious schools. In a panel, it is also shown that one of the new schools of Munnu was earlier a home of Kashmiri Pandits, the minority Hindus who were displaced from their homeland. And the belongings of the Pandits were covered or concealed by boards, hinting at the entangled layers of memories woven in the rich tapestry of the Kashmir Valley. The schools hence act as a palimpsest of memories and also represent a microcosm of the militarized zone. The corporeal punishments, the violence perpetuated by the disciplinary system, and the hostility many children bore in their minds against the state, other religious communities, and against their own people is metonymic of the overall political climate of the valley. The image shows how Munu was treated in the religious school for writing a love letter to his classmate Salma. It is the first image, and the second image shows the punishment methods in school, which really is metaphorical representation of the violence that is going on in the valley. So the particular scene in which there is one more panel which I haven't brought in this slide. In that particular scene, Munu was requested by his friends to carve miniatures of AK-47 guns out of chalks, and the way in which many of his classmates show their adeptness in handling guns or making petrol bombs highlights how children no more represents the innocent victims. They demonstrated agency, rebellion, and were often harbingers of violent political strategies. This raises significant questions on how the children get embroiled in political conflicts during wars and insurgencies. So it is obvious that a conflict zone where violence is pervasive, any group can utilize the child's vulnerability for their motives other than self-defense. This challenges the idea of the innocent child victim and underscores Hannah Arendt's notion of the banality of evil. The bullet holes on the walls in Badawi and the old wreckage dilapidated schools and infrastructure in Munnu records the impairment of the physical and mental spaces of the victim. The familiarity of these children in Kashmir with barbed wire fences and the image of Ahmed collecting fragments of shrapnel and bullets after the explosion shows how material objects are, those associated with violence, are ingrained in the childhood memories. The emotional, physical, and material ruins which are embedded in the individual and collective memory, hence opens up new ways to discuss how the debris of childhood memories are recollected and reconstructed in the graphic narratives. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amrutha. That's a wonderful paper. Thank you for some wonderful images as well. Maybe if you could stop screen share, we'll go to the question answer. Thank you very much. So many thanks to Lisa and to Amrutha for some really fabulous presentation. Again, actually, I think very combined by the notion of visual metaphor, may I say, Lisa. I think Amrutha's been doing some wonderful work in her paper on visual metaphor. So I think there's lots of commonality of intellectual endeavour between your two papers. So colleagues, we have about 15-20 minutes for questions. So I'm very happy for colleagues that if you want to raise your hand or if you want to put a question in the chat, you're very welcome. Or because we're quite a small group, if you want to unmute yourself, very welcome for you to ask questions that way. So I've got some questions that are bubbling in my head, but I'm very happy if colleagues would like to begin from the floor with any questions for Amrutha or Lisa, or any questions for them both. I'll open the floor to begin with. If you want to raise a hand, colleagues, or put your question in the chat. I shall start then. So I shall start. What I was really struck by, Lisa and Amrutha, was obviously the recourse to forms of visual metaphor across both of your papers. And I wanted to begin firstly by asking Amrutha about the animal metaphors in Munnu, because clearly I'm thinking of Art Spiegelman and mouse when I'm watching those images. They're black and white images, and they are very, very redolent in my mind of the drawing style of Art Spiegelman as well. So I did want to ask you, and the animal fable, which of course is a particular feature of Western European culture. So I wanted to ask whether you think that Malik Sajat had reflected on mouse, a potential precursor text, and the animal fable, how far that's part of the Kashmiri culture from which the text is drawn. So, and again, I have a question for Lisa. It's my first question for Amrutha.
Thank you, Dr. Kerr, for your question. In fact, there is a particular panel in which Munnu shows how he draws inspiration from Spiegelman's mouse. So of course the influence is there, but in mouse I think there are different hierarchies of animals that is represented. But in Munnu, what happens is the entire Kashmiri folk, Kashmiris are demonstrated as hanguls, and hanguls is an endangered species of deer present, I think, particularly to Kashmir. So if we go through the text, we can find that the other people, those who are related to government, like military personnel or soldiers, they are shown in human form, with facial features and with muscular body. But in Munnu's case, it shows a sense of hunched figure. It is kind of a liminal state. You are both, your body is human, but your head is of a hangul, which shows your existence between life and death, probably. And maybe it also shows that I have already mentioned about the political discourse where animals are being hunted down by humans. And I think Munnu also represents too. But I'm not quite sure about the folklores or folktales which has this particular reference to hanguls, but in general, it has resonance with mouse, and it definitely depicts that precarity of existence.
Thank you. So interesting. Thank you so much. I hadn't thought about the hybridity, the humanoid body and the deer head. Thank you. Yeah. And to you, Lisa, I was very interested in metaphor in the eggs. So many images of eggs, box of eggs for cooking, obviously, like fertility eggs. And I wanted to ask you whether, and again, you've given us the texts appear to have a very female-orientated perspective. Are any of the visual metaphors focused around fatherhood? And you talked about the one sex and the two sex model. Is there any sense in which that egg metaphor for fertility starts to encompass the male partner or male contribution? So, or whether the focus is on that metaphor for, I suppose, the cyclical nature of the female body. Do you get any other bodily references that bring in the partner?
Not that I can think of at the moment. So I think I would say all three of them are very much focused on the female perspective, which is interesting, and their partners, their role is more supportive, and in all cases, in all three cases, the partners are actually much more understanding and supportive, unless they're not putting pressure on their partners, really. So it's the families and society more generally, I think, that are perceived to be putting that pressure on, not the partners. So I can't really think of any metaphors that would involve the male partners, but it's an interesting question. I might have to read them again to look out for that. Yeah. I was thinking as well with because I haven't actually read Munnu, and I'm going to, the first thing I'm going to do now when I come off this Zoom meeting, I'm going to order it because it looks brilliant. But I was also wondering, because one of the things I suppose that happens if you choose an animal, animal imagery instead of human images, is that you can focus on particular aspects of that experience without the sort of aspects of identity intruding. So I think some graphic novelists, they make that decision deliberately, especially if they want to tell a more universal story, I think, and also if they don't want people to be distracted by aspects of identity such as age or race or gender and so on, because they're quite they're neutral in those terms, aren't they, really? So it's kind of focusing on their identity as very vulnerable beings, I suppose. But what you do lose then is the individuality. So I was just wondering, how easy is it to actually track who's who in this story, or do they all look a little bit alike?
Do you want to respond to that, Amrutha, to Lisa's query around the both the advantages of the animal metaphor, but also the de-individuality that's potentially occurs when you have a species or an animal species representing humans?
Yeah, that's actually a wonderful question, which I probably haven't looked at, maybe disadvantages, but yeah, I think that at some point there is, I have read somewhere that like what Spencer Clark says, there is a humanization of history that happens, because at times it is your facial features or your gestures that would convey the trauma of what is going on. But even when we analyze Munnu with other texts, you could never, at times you could never differentiate Munnu with other people, because they all look the same and they have the same expression. If they are crying, of course, there are illustrations which shows tears, but more than that, we never know what emotions are going on there. So that affective quality at times is problematic, but I think that maybe that is also a problem with our interpretation at times, because maybe Malik Sajat intends to show their frozen emotions, I don't know, but yeah, that sense of de-embodiment and dehumanization due to that, like what we talks about translation, there is always something that is lost in those animal metaphors. Yeah, probably because it is a human who is the reader. So we ways in which we relate that text, it at times differentiate. But I think in India's case, there are maybe people are more familiar with these human animal figures because we have this in folklores, epics, and so in that sense, in India's case, maybe Munnu is more relatable, and maybe that's why he adopted such a stylistic device. Probably that's my interpretation. I don't know whether he intended like that.
Thank you, Amrutha. I think Roussel's written in the chat here, colleagues. She's written, can I ask Dr. El Refaie to elaborate on her typology of pictorial, spatial, and stylistic metaphor, particularly the difference between pictorial and stylistic? Would you maybe give us a few observations there, Lisa? And then I think Roussel would like to see if Amrutha might be able to make some connections, potential comments on that.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, the distinction. So mostly when people talk about visual metaphor, they are talking about pictorial metaphors. So basically, where you use the image of a concrete object or creature or situation in the world, and use that to stand for something else. So, you know, most of the images we were talking about were pictorial metaphors, and sometimes they might be verbal pictorial in the sense that, so for example, with the eggs, that the eggs, you know, without the words, they're just eggs. But if you add the words, then they become a metaphor for human fertility as well, I guess. So that's pictorial, but then I would say that there's also ways in which we exploit the sense of our bodies in space and project that onto more abstract things. So in that's of course in language as well. So if you say something like, you know, I'm feeling very up or I'm feeling very down, that is in effect exploiting the universal experience of gravity. And having to resist gravity, and that, you know, has been shown across all cultures to lead to these associations of up with things that are good and healthy and powerful and so on, whereas down is associated with its opposites. So that's just one example, but there's also we also associate different things with left and right, and those are partly cultural, but it has been shown very convincingly, I think, to be associated with partly with handedness. So people who are right-handed have been shown in multiple studies to implicitly associate things on the right-hand side with positive things, and on the left with more negative things, and that's because of dexterity, whereas people who are left-handed have the opposite associations. And you can manipulate that by which is quite interesting, by for example, if somebody breaks their hand and is not as dexterous, then that switches that preference. But also reading direction. So up and down, left and right, but also inside and outside. And things like size, relative size, but they're all things where we're exploiting the experience of our bodies in space, and that doesn't always have to be associated with a pictorial metaphor. So it could be, you know, that you're just drawing a figure very, very small and another one very, very large, for example. Or you could draw, you know, a character lying on the floor, but they can also be right at the bottom of the page or right at the bottom of a panel, for instance, to show something about their sadness, for instance. Yeah, and the left and right, there are lots of interesting uses. You know, for example, just that image I showed with the hourglass. You know, why the present self would be on the left and the future self on the right. You know, that's already interesting. So you can look at all these what I would call spatial metaphors. And then finally, stylistic is where the line, the quality of the line, or of things like, you know, shapes and colors are used again to indicate, where visual properties are used to indicate either a non-visual sense perception or something more abstract. So for instance, again, I mean, light and darkness, or white and black, also have these universal associations with day and night and the things that we associate with that. But also, if you have a very scratchy lines or very thick lines and so on, they can also indicate something about partly about how they were produced, so the movements that would have produced those lines, but then they can also be used, for example, to indicate pain or loud sounds, for instance, and things like that. So that's that's a distinction I make, basically. But in order to know more, you have to read my book, because that describes those differences in great detail.
Thank you. That's great. So again, spatial, pictorial, and stylistics. Amrutha, would you find some of those distinctions in the text that you've been talking about today?
Oh yeah. In fact, spatial. I think I talked a bit about the spatial metaphors, but I didn't have much time to go into that, because in Badawi there are I think concrete pictures of the refugee camp, in which they can maybe we talk about the bare life in refugee camp at times, but it is not about that bare life or precariousness. There is a sense of warmth, cordial relations, and maybe even when your family is not, there are people. So but I still think that they are not using that metaphors in that sense. They are showing their normal life, but spatial metaphors in Badawi are less, I would say, even if there is refugee camp and there is that abstract third space that is there, the reference to third space. But again, then if I talk about pictorial metaphors, there is one scene in which the children in the camp go out for hunting birds, and they in a violent rush, they shoot this Ahmad, and he had to live with that pellets for the rest of his life. So it is not about hunting alone. It is not about violence or a child's play. It is about violence that permeates. It is also a metaphor for how the Palestinians have to live with their cultural memory. So I think that they weave such metaphors, and in Munu's case, I think it is more concrete. They are not using metaphors much for violence, except for that the entire text is a metaphor. Entire text is using animal metaphors. But maybe, I don't know if I have missed something in that, but there are also the ways in which there is one scene which shows a rat trap, which probably indicates the maybe a metaphor for Kashmiri's life. But yeah, it is a huge text, and I may not be probably remembering things. That's how I see it. But I think I have to look into the stylistic devices. It is when Russell was talking about these things, I was thinking, oh yeah. But I think that prominently graphic narratives deal with the pictorial representations. Because it is more, I believe that graphics, whatever we say about the visual verbal synchrony, it is always pictorial. And but there are some other texts which I haven't mentioned here, which definitely deals with these pictorial spatial aspects in a more elaborate sense, like Lamia Siaradwyr, Bywyd Babylon. Yeah, there are texts, but I think for these two texts, it's a bit difficult to spot on, at least for now.
I'm sure I could spot some. I'll have a look. We can continue the discussion.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Colleagues from the floor, any questions or comments that you want to? Oh yes, so Darius has written a question. Darius has said, can graphic life narratives be applied as a method in social sciences? That is a very good question. So can they be employed as a method, as a means of investigation in social sciences? can I maybe start with you on that one, Lisa?
So certainly one of the projects I've been involved with for a while now uses drawings as a way of getting at people's experiences of what we call, well, invisible health conditions. So we've developed this workshop method, which is it was basically in response to a psychologist colleague of mine who researches infertility, and she what they discovered, what they found was that most of the people who volunteer to take part in research projects tend to be, white, middle class, well educated, and so on, and it was always very difficult to get participants who are from minority ethnic groups or whose first language isn't English and so on. So we developed this method of encouraging people to draw their experiences, and then using both the drawings and their commentary on the drawings as data, really. So that could be used, and I've done something similar as well with a charity in Africa a while ago where we actually devised some drawing workshops for youngsters about their experience of HIV. So that was in KwaZulu-Natal, and also in Ghana, about the young people's fears and concerns about Ebola at the time. And they sort of drew little comics, and then, we used that partly as data, but partly then also to create, information brochures and so for their peers, really. So in that sense, I think you can use graphic narratives or life narratives in that sense as in order to get data on any topic, really. Particularly, I think, sensitive and taboo topics, because people tend to be more willing to talk, actually, and it's not quite as it's a bit more open than asking questions, I think. So you can get it at different groups, and you can also perhaps encourage people to talk about things that you might not have even considered, really.
Yes,
I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah.
Oh, that's good. I mean, again, here at Cardiff, Darius, this would be like what we call creative research methods. And there are a number of PhD students who, as Lisa was outlining, have used drawing or forms of non-scriptural, non-written or non-verbal to access, maybe working with younger children in schools where it's difficult to articulate positions in a complex fashion, but drawing often draws out the experiences in ways that the drawer feels more comfortable expressing, rather than, for example, issues that relate, for example, to difficulties at home. So certainly it's a method that a number of our social science colleagues have used in their work, particularly working with younger children. Amrutha, would you want to come in here about your perspective on this?
Yeah, I think for the text which I'm particularly dealing with, that those works definitely connect us with the refugee experiences. And so I think that in maybe social sciences are using a lot of interdisciplinary methodologies like anthropology, refugee studies, migration. So this might be definitely useful, because there is a sense of empathy that these graphic narratives, the visual metaphors or the visual representations can create. And I think there are projects which are going on, like I have recently seen like Train to Busan. I think that was the name of that graphic text, I think, and that deals with human trafficking or like women, women slaves who were raped during Second World War in Korea. I think I'm not sure about the content, but yeah, before reading graphic narratives, I was really ignorant about these rape victims in Korea during Second World War, and they still live, and their human rights are yet to be in question. So yeah, these are also part of human rights narratives, which I would definitely agree with, and that itself makes it a suitable scheme to work in social sciences, I guess.
Thank you, Amrutha. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you very much, colleagues, for your questions. Any final questions before we close the webinar? No? Well, can I thank Lisa and Amrutha very much for fabulous presentations and a really rich discussion, which has taken us in many directions, from social science creative methods through to visual metaphor and some really close readings of life narratives across very different contexts, but I think with comparable use and or mobilization of the graphic novel format to really deal with some thorny challenges. Thank you very much, Lisa. Thank you very much, Amrutha. And thank you very much, colleagues. We will now, I think, stop the recording of the session.